Did you know that one click of a button in the middle of the Cold War could have resulted in the end of humanity? There will be no 21st century, no smartphones, no Facebook, no YouTube, and no Wikipedia. At one point in the Cold War, 70,000 nuclear bombs would have exploded, which is more than enough to vaporize every living organism on the Earth's atmosphere. The US made several attempts to warn and cause fear to the USSR. One case is when the US military flew its planes carrying nuclear bombs around the world. It was a warning to the USSR, and the United States wanted to keep them under control. However, 5 of these planes crashed, which led to nuclear contamination, resulting in at least 2 instances. Okay, starting from the 1940s, there was a top-secret mission to transform the principles of theoretical physics into a devastating new nuclear weapon that could be delivered by plane against Nazi Germany and Japan. This will later become what is known as the Manhattan Project. Bombs the US dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 to end the war with Japan were made by 130,000 people employed at secret sites in New York, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, and New Mexico. Costs for the Manhattan Project totaled about $21.6 billion through 1945. 63% of this total went toward producing highly enriched uranium at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Another 21% was expended at Hanford, producing plutonium. The first nuclear bomb was successfully tested in July 16, 1945 in New Mexico. The bomb was a product of the Manhattan Project. Many Americans felt proof of a nuclear weapon could dissuade the Soviet Union from acting against them. They also felt that bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki would show power of the US. The successful test of the bomb only led to more powerful weapons, though. Now, how was the United States able to make the first nuclear weapon before the other nations? To begin with, the US had gone through the Industrial Revolution where they used raw materials and refined them into more useful resources. This allowed them to have an excess of money as well as refined resources, which are mandatory if you're going to try and develop a nuclear weapon. This is why they were able to build the first nuclear weapon. Now we're going to talk about the bombs dropped in Japan. The Allied powers had already defeated Germany, so the only country that remained was Japan. Japan had sworn to fight to the end, and this was considered as a threat to the USA. The Japanese army had managed to inflict about half of the casualties the Allied forces had in 3 years. This was what made the US nervous. They had already tested the nuclear bombs that were capable of destroying a whole city, and they were ready to use them. After the US had bombed Hiroshima and 3 days later bombed Nagasaki, an estimated of 120,000 people died on the impact of the bomb. This eventually led to the proliferation of the nuclear weapons. A weapon with such power should not be used in a war never again. After that, the USSR also successfully tested nuclear bombs. In late September of 1949, President Harry Truman announced to the Americans that the Soviets too had the bomb. The bomb, codenamed First Lightning, was detonated at the Semipalatinsk test site of Kazakhstan on August 29, 1949, becoming the second nation in the world to acquire nuclear capabilities. After that, the UN's first resolution in 1946 is the control of atomic energy to ensure its use for only peaceful purposes, and also the elimination of national armaments of atomic weapons and all other major weapons to adaptable to mass destruction. After that, the UK tested nuclear weapons in Australia, October 1952. The UK tested 12 major nuclear weapons in Australia between the years 1952 and 1957. A major test site that was used multiple times was Maralinga in the Woomera Prohibited region in South Australia. The 2 major tests conducted there were codenamed Operation Buffalo and Operation Antler. After 2 cleanups in the region, in the year 2000, the site was free of radiation with a cost of $108 million. Nuclear tests were banned in Antarctica in December 1959. A treaty signed banning the following: establishment of military bases, military maneuvers, stationing or testing any type of weapon, nuclear explosions, and the disposal of radioactive waste. After that, France tested its first nuclear weapon in February 13, 1960. At that time, France was one of the 5 nuclear weapon states in the world. Currently, France has around 300 warheads, and it has the 3rd largest number of nuclear. Later, in 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion happened. In January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew Fulgencio Batista, a US-backed president. The US tried to remove Castro from power for the next 2 years. In April 1961, the CIA launched a full-scale invasion of Cuba by 1,400 American-trained Cubans. Outnumbered by Castro's troops, the US surrendered in less than 24 hours. As much as President Kennedy did not want to abandon Cuba to the communists, he did not want to start a fight that might end in World War III. Kennedy had inherited Eisenhower's CIA campaign to train and equip a guerrilla army of Cuban exiles, but he has some doubts about the wisdom of the plan. The last thing he wanted, he said, was direct overt intervention by the American military in Cuba. The Soviets will likely see this as an act of war and might retaliate. However, CIA officers told him they would keep US involvement in the invasion a secret, and if all went according to the plan, the campaign would spark an anti-Castro uprising on the island. The US has not been able to remove Fidel Castro until this day. Fidel Castro is not in power, but his brother is. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. It was between the US and the USSR, and Kennedy was notified that the Soviet had planted nuclear missiles in Cuba and decided that he had to take an action. A 13-day political and military standoff in October 1962 was the main event. John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev confronted each other eyeball to eyeball, since both had the power of mass destruction. A war would mean at least 100 million dead Americans and 100 million dead Russians. After a week of knowing, Kennedy announced to the rest of the world and imposed a naval blockade. In the second week, neither side backed off. Kennedy did not back off nor attack the Soviet missiles in Cuba, but created an alternative with 3 components. First, public deal in which the United States pledged not to invade Cuba if the Soviet withdrew its missiles. Second, a warning threatening to attack Cuba within 24 hours if the offer was rejected. Third, and if the Soviet Union accepted, they would withdraw the US missiles in Turkey within 6 months. This caused all the citizens in the whole world to fear of a nuclear war. At the end, the Soviet accepted this component of Kennedy, and the world was back to peace. China conducts its first nuclear test in 1964. China explodes its first atomic bomb at the Lop Nor testing site in Xinjiang province. China's efforts to develop a nuclear weapon program began in response to what it deemed as nuclear blackmail from the United States. In July 1950, at the very beginning of the Korean War, U.S. President Harry Truman ordered 10 nuclear-configured B-29s to the Pacific with the intention of deterring China from entering the Cold War. 1968, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is signed, NPT. The 5 nuclear states, France, China, US, USSR, and Britain, can keep their nuclear weapons. However, they can't assist anyone else in developing the weapons. Second, the non-nuclear states agreed to never acquire nuclear weapons. Third, legal states agreed to disarm the nuclear weapons. Fourth, however, nuclear energy is still allowed. According to the United Nations website, the NPT's objective was to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and weapons technology, to promote cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and to further the goal of achieving nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament. The treaty entered into force in 1970. On May 11, 1995, the treaty was extended indefinitely. After that, Latin America becomes nuclear-free in 1967. The treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons in Latin America, the Treaty of Tlatelolco, is signed at Mexico City. Parties agree not to manufacture, test, nor acquire nuclear weapons. Non-Proliferation Treaty is signed in 1968. Although the NPT did not ultimately prevent nuclear proliferation, in the context of the Cold War arms race and mounting international concern about the consequences of nuclear war, the treaty was a major success for advocates of arms control because it set a precedent for international cooperation between nuclear and non-nuclear states to prevent proliferation. After that, India conducts the first nuclear test in 1974. Smiling Buddha is the codename of the first successful bomb of India. It was the first one to break the CTBT and the NPT at the same time. The US and Soviet leaders discussed abolition of nuclear weapons in 1986. US President Ronald Reagan and Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev meet at Reykjavik, Iceland, where they seriously discussed the possibility of achieving nuclear abolition. In quotes, the course of the meetings was largely shaped by Reagan's nuclear abolitionism and his conviction that the goal was close at hand. At the meeting, Gorbachev set out a number of important concessions that suddenly made the U.S. delegation believe that agreements on deep reductions in strategic and intermediate-range nuclear weapons were possible. After a day and a half of haggling between Reagan and Gorbachev, Reagan proposed that they abolish all nuclear weapons. Gorbachev agreed, and so did Schwartz and Soviet Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze. They planned to turn over the details of abolition to a team that could prepare a treaty to be signed in Washington. But Gorbachev insisted that the SDI must be restricted to the laboratory. Reagan tried to convince Gorbachev of his vision of SDI as the guarantor of a nuclear-free world, when Gorbachev replied that if he agreed to deal without killing SDI, he could not go back to Moscow, and he would be called a dummy and not a leader. Neither would he budge, and there the meeting ended. Now, how does the nuclear arms race connect with the world we are living in right now? On July 14, 2015, China, France, Germany, Russia, the UK, the US, the EU, and Iran reached a joint comprehensive plan of action, the JCPOA, to ensure that Iran's nuclear program will be exclusively peaceful. The deal prevents every form in which Iran could have acquired nuclear weapons and constant monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, to keep in track that Iran's following is the treaty.